This is the Virtual Jewel Box, the podcast of the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah. I'm Robert Carson, Associate Director of the Tanner, and today I'm talking with Jake Nelson, Virgil C. Aldrich Faculty Fellow here in the center. Professor Nelson is Associate Professor of Communication here in the College of Humanities and is working on a project related to public trust in a variety of institutions, including the news media. Welcome. Tell us about what you're working on this year.
Thank you for having me. So the project that I'm currently working on draws on interviews with members of the public where they weigh in on their trust or lack thereof in journalism, in healthcare, and in higher education. Before I became an associate professor at the University of Utah, I started my professional career as a journalist. So I got my PhD from Northwestern. And then when I finished my PhD, I got my first academic job as an assistant professor at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. And I was there for 4 years before coming to Utah. During that time, basically for the majority of my academic career, I've been focused on understanding why journalists and news audiences think about and interact with each other the way that they do. So that's led into this project that I'm currently working on, now titled Why We Distrust, American Skepticism Toward Media, Medicine, and Higher Education. So the idea for the project originated during the pandemic. I was working with my co-author, Seth Lewis, who is a professor at the University of Oregon, and he and I were gathering data about people's news consumption during the pandemic. This was pretty early on in basically spring of 2020. And our guiding question was essentially there were two. Where are you going to get news about the pandemic? And how are you deciding which outlets you trust versus those that you do not? And what we were hearing very consistently during those early months of the pandemic from the people that we interviewed was that people had a great deal of interest in news. They were consuming so much more news than they ever did before because the pandemic was there was such urgency in that story. It affected so much of their daily lives. And so they wanted to be kept informed. However, they were incredibly skeptical of essentially all information that they were receiving. It almost didn't matter which outlets they were using. They were approaching all of those outlets and all of the information that they were getting from those outlets with a great deal of skepticism. And we found that very interesting. And so we have since then been working on this project that is aspiring to understand why that widespread skepticism has become so prevalent among the public, how it's affecting people's interactions with news media, and what it says about the moment that we're in, that people feel compelled to present themselves as being so suspicious of journalism. And so that's the journalism aspect of it. The way in which we decided to incorporate healthcare and higher education is a bit less, academic, I guess not the word I should use. What happened was at that same time that we were gathering these data, my wife, who is a pediatrician and who was pregnant at the time, was doing telehealth because she was pregnant and we were unsure what would happen if she was exposed to COVID, so she was doing telehealth rather than doing patient care in her clinic. And so I was having these Zooms with members of the public about their distrust in journalism at the same time that she was having these telehealth appointments with patients that were increasingly filled with expressions of distrust of the medical establishment, specifically of vaccinations.
Can you specify the months that this was?
Yeah, so the interviews, I believe, began in April. So I think that the interviews took place between April and June of 2020.
Okay.
So pre-vaccine. I don't want to guess basically why the skepticism toward vaccines was so prevalent in these conversations. I assume that it was something to do with the fact that there was so much in distrust toward the medical establishment within the first Trump administration's approach to the pandemic. But anyway, we were hearing very similar things about distrust. It's just that hers was framed toward one institution, mine was framed toward another. And so Seth and I realized that there's something to that overlap, that there's something compelling about and important about this distrust toward that is so similar and yet pointed toward these completely different institutions. And so much of the time, academic research, just by virtue of being discipline specific and institution specific, is focused on one thing. For the most part, my research has focused on journalism specifically. And it's because I don't know very much about healthcare. I don't know very much about higher education, except that I work in higher education. But the fact that it seems that people's distrust of the news media seems to originate from a similar place and look very similar to their distrust of healthcare. And our hypothesis is also that it will look similar to their distrust of higher education. We felt that it was important to take a comparative approach. And that's what we're doing with this project. And our hope is that we'll be able to show to people who read this book that this distrust is not institution specific. And therefore, it is important to understand that it is not incumbent on any one institution to solve this problem. Like journalism by itself cannot get the public to trust it more, the same way that I don't believe that people within healthcare can get the public to trust healthcare more. Um, there is something about where conventional wisdom has taken the public, that the conventional wisdom now is to be suspicious of everything. And I think that that is such a powerful force. I think that it's beyond the ability of any one institution to tackle that on their own.
A lot of things in the narrative you just gave about doing these interviews. Can you say just a little bit more about finding the people, how you chose the people you interview, how the interviews were structured, when you did them?
Yeah. So when we first started doing these in 2020, first we worked with Qualtrics to get a panel of people, of participants that we could reach out to. And basically, Qualtrics gave a very short survey to people that was a representative sample of the US public in terms of gender, education, income, political identity, political affiliation. And then part of the survey that Qualtrics gave them asked them for their email addresses and their phone numbers and if they'd be willing to be interviewed via Zoom as a follow-up. And so those that did yes were passed along to us. We emailed these people, and we had a list of hundreds and hundreds of names. We emailed them to do interviews. This was at the very start of Zoom becoming a ubiquitous tool that it is now become. And so we would reach out to these people. They get a link to make an appointment with us, and then we would do a Zoom interview with them. And these interviews were an hour long, and they were semi-structured, which means that I had a list of questions, Seth had a list of questions. We tried to hit as many of them as we could, but we also left a lot of room for follow-up questions because in my experience doing this kind of work, so much of what makes interviewing a valuable form of data collection and so much of its strength, I think, as an alternative to surveys, not that I don't think surveys are valuable, but I think that the values are different, the strengths are different, is the ability to ask follow-up questions and to, I think, get into the details and to really allow people to work through feelings and beliefs and ideas that they've never truly articulated until that very moment. And it's a wonderful thing to experience when you're in it, when you're having these conversations. It's truly one of my favorite forms of data collection.
So that's a fascinating moment there that you have in these interviews. You have the sense that people are saying things out loud for the first time. Like what kinds of things? What kinds of things come out in those moments?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that a very typical sequence of events that happens during these conversations, and I say typical because they did end up following this path, that it wasn't like we were guiding them. We were asking very open-ended questions that were essentially, where are you going for news? How are you choosing those sources? How much time are you spending with them? How are you determining what's true or false? And basically going from there. And it was infrequent that there was a lot of thought given to the specific sources. A lot of time it was sort of like, well, I just go to whatever my search browser defaults to. Like if I open my browser and it's, Bing or something, like whatever that news outlet is, that's where I'm getting my news from. Or I remember I interviewed someone who said, well, our family, we watch a lot of CNN because that is the app that came on our Roku. They're not proactively seeking out sources. It's just what's been presented to them. which makes sense. You know, in the broadcast era, people were not necessarily thinking, oh, I'm going to choose CBS because I have an affinity for it. It's just that was what was on, you know? People are sort of falling into these news repertoires, and they're spending a lot of time with the news.
Well, also for a large number of working people, with some major exceptions, people are just at home with nothing to do. So everyone is, as they say, terminally online.
That's a huge part of it.
And also the phenomenon of doom scrolling, which I feel like that term maybe emerged a little bit later.
Yes.
But so you also have, a lot of indoor life.
Yes.
Right?
And to be honest, that is what originated the project. There's this term in my world called audience availability, which refers to exactly what you're describing. The amount of time that people spend with media is contingent upon the amount of time that they have available to spend with media in the first place, which is something that a lot of people in journalism don't necessarily always think about, because in their minds, the formula is the amount of time someone spends with news is contingent upon the amount of interest that they have in news. And so if people aren't spending a lot of time with the news, journalists, in my experience, tend to either assume that it's because the journalists are not doing a good enough job getting the public interested in those news stories. Like maybe they could be telling the story a little bit differently. But more often they're blaming the public. They're saying, no, people just don't care about the news. This is they're not invested in these topics because they're just not being good citizens, basically. You know, it's a very dismissive approach to the audience. And I have, my advisor when I was getting my PhD was not a journalism studies person. He was a media audiences person, an audience studies person. And so his approach to understanding how audiences engage with media was detached from these sort of like lofty goals that tend to be implicit or explicit in conversations about people's news consumption. It was just more about, okay, well, why are people tuning into this show or that show, or not tuning in at all? And something that he often argued in his work was that audience availability was very important.
And in this sense, an audience for journalism is no different than an audience for anything else.
Exactly.
The professional sort of self-image of the journalist falls away once you start asking this question.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very important thing to do, because I think that especially in this moment where most members of the public, I think, treat the news media as just another form of media that is vying for their attention, journalists do themselves a disservice when they treat their own product as being loftier or more noble or more important. I think it is. Personally speaking, I do think that it is, but I think that it's a mistake to treat it that way in the news production process, because I think then they are assuming that people will feel like duty bound to consume news, and people do not feel that way. But to get back to your question, people did have tremendous availability during the pandemic because they were home. And that is a huge reason why they were consuming more news. When we asked them that, that's exactly what they said. I'm home. I have more time on my hands because I'm not working. And we went into this with that hypothesis because there was already data showing that. There was already data that showed that TV news had increased, and also the time in which TV news was most popular had changed. So it used to be that TV news consumption pre-pandemic was really at its peak, I think, at around like 7 a.m. But during the lockdown, it went to midday. And it made a lot of sense. You had the TV on while you're getting ready for work before you got into the car to go. Then when you were locked down, you just had the TV on during the day or at lunchtime or whatever. Who cares? So the audience availability played a really, really strong role in compelling people to spend more time with news. Not to mention the fact that the pandemic itself felt like such an urgent story that was affecting every facet of their lives. But what we learned in these interviews was that people felt like they, what would typically happen in these conversations, people would talk about how they don't trust one outlet or another. And we would say, what I often do in these conversations is I just attempt to paraphrase what people are saying to me and sort of ask them to respond to my attempt to sort of synthesize what they've said,
Almost therapeutic in a way.
I do feel that there is a therapeutic component to it. That is exactly it. And I do feel that people genuinely appreciate it. I do feel at the end of these conversations, people feel lighter than they did before. And sometimes the people that I spoke with would say things that I did an interview with someone who was a conspiracy theorist, who was talking about how he mostly got his news from very off the beaten path YouTube channels. And he believed that the earth was flat, and he believed that George Soros was controlling everything. And, he had some beliefs that were completely wrong. And in those conversations, my approach is never to try to introduce any second guessing or
You're not intervening with
I'm
these
not
people.
intervening. I'm coming at it from a complete place of curiosity. Just tell me more about a hat, and why do you think that outlet is telling you the news that is correct, but CNN is not to be trusted? Like, what is the difference there? Really trying to understand what got them on this path toward these news media diets that have led them so straight factually. And it's always very interesting. And yeah, as I was saying, where we end up getting sort of the building blocks for our argument come from the synthesis, where someone's talking about how, oh, well, you can't trust that outlet and you can't trust this outlet. And you're saying, it kind of seems like you're spending a great deal of time with news, but you also don't seem like you have a great deal of trust in news. Is that accurate? And they're like, yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought of it before. And then I say, well, so what do you do then? How do you know what's true or what's false? And then they say, well, I end up having to do a lot of fact checking on my own. And that was a recurring theme in the work that we did in these interviews with people describing their fact checking processes. Basically they're doing their own research to corroborate the stories that they're reading. And of course, and I often ended up asking, it sounds like you're doing a great deal of work to determine if something is true or not, because you're not just reading a news story, you're then going out of your way to conduct this sort of like, de facto scientific process that you've put together.
Are people fact checking stories in news outlets, or is that strictly what they're talking about, or were people also talking about fact checking sort of memes in circulation and among different political
It's all
camps?
of it.
Okay,
It's all of it. Okay. What we often heard was the former, because we were asking about news consumption specifically.
Right.
I'm sure that they're doing it with memes as well, but I think that from their perspective, these conversations were about checking news stories.
Okay.
And I will say, who knows how much they're actually doing any of that? I think that
that was my next question.
Yeah.
A sense that people, you said in your initial introduction of this, that people were presenting themselves as skeptical, right? So on one hand, you're asking people to describe their own behavior, which may be more accurate, less accurate, whatever. But then they're also presenting, as you said, presenting an image of themselves for the first time to someone. And did you have the feeling that people were taking extra care to present themselves as skeptical and rigorous?
Yes. Here's what I will say, and here's how we describe it, because this unsurprisingly is something that when we submit these articles to academic journals, or we've submitted the book as a proposal to presses, reviewers bring this up. And I think they bring it up rightly, with the question of, okay, well, people are saying this, but you don't know if they're actually doing any of it. So why should we believe them? Like, why should we put any stock in any of this? And I have two answers to it. The first is, yeah, who knows? Who knows if they are actually engaging in these fact-checking processes, and if they are, how much time they're actually spending doing it compared to the amount of time that they are saying that they're doing it. My sense, if I had to guess, is that probably they're doing it much less frequently than they say that they're doing it, but they are ever doing it. But I would almost say that the extent to which what they're saying aligns with what they're doing is beside the point. And it's beside the point because what's important here is that they feel compelled to posture in this particular way.
And so that would be statements not just about what they're doing, but what they trust, the extent of their trust, how they report, how they think about these things.
Right.
People are horrible at estimating the time they spend on doing stuff, right? But to be asked, do you trust this?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a moment where there could be a quick presentation of self going on.
Yeah. But people say that they don't trust the news. They still spend a great deal of time with news. Presumably, they are actually believing some of the things that they're consuming, even if they're saying at a general level, I don't trust this entire institution. Mm-hmm. And what I would say to that is that's still important. That disconnect between what they're saying about their relationship with the news media versus how they're actually approaching their relationship with the news media is important, because, again, it comes back to this idea of this is how they feel compelled to present themselves to the world. And, when we went into this project, Seth and I wondered, well, they're going to know that we are journalism professors. I wonder if that's going to make people feel compelled to talk more positively about the news. It wasn't that way at all.
No.
It wasn't that way at all. And
finally, they had a chance to tell a journalist what they thought, right? Yeah,
exactly. And as you were saying, people are notoriously bad at accurately conveying the amount of time that they spend doing anything. People have often been observed exaggerating the amount of time that they spend with news media, and some believe that it's because they just don't do a good job recalling the amount of time that they spend. But others wonder if it's because they feel compelled to posture. Yeah, I spend a great deal of time with news because I am an informed citizen and I understand that is sort of an important part of conveying myself as a smart person in today's society.
Well, I mean, a student saying, "Well, I spent 4 hours studying for this test. Why did this happen?" Right?
Yeah. But so that is the reason why it's so important that people feel compelled to say that they don't trust any news right now, because it's the same mechanism. The same, I want to make sure that my peers think that I'm smart. And instead of that being all about saying how much news I'm consuming, the way in which they are attempting to persuade people that they're smart is by describing themselves as incredibly skeptical.
Were there any differences in age, education, income level, ethnicity, religious affiliation? I'm sure that the outlets consumed are, vary in predictable ways. But what about the structure of of people's relationship to it?
Yeah.
Were there any trends in that?
Yeah. So what we were actually struck by was the overlap among disparate subgroups within this representative sample. And the one that most jumped out at us was the bipartisan skepticism toward the news media. I think just because there's a lot of very compelling survey data that suggests that conservatives are much more likely to distrust the news media than liberals. And I think that we did find that it skewed that way a little bit, but less than we expected to. And what was interesting was that we heard conservatives and liberals speaking with disdain, with similar kinds of disdain towards the news media, even if they were talking about different outlets. Conservatives did describe spending more time with outlets like Fox News. However, they would also say, yeah, but you can't trust everything on Fox News either because they are just telling Trump supporters what they want to hear. They were speaking of this understanding that they were those Trump supporters. They're saying like, Fox just wants to placate me. And because they want to placate me, I have to be a little suspicious of them.
That's quite heartening to hear, actually. That people have a sense that they think they have my number, right?
Exactly. And I heard the exact same thing from some of the liberals that I interviewed about NPR. I remember interviewing someone who said NPR is so anti-Trump, which I am also, but it sometimes it's like it feels like it's coming at the expense of their accuracy, basically. And so it's like the people that we interviewed. It kind of cuts against like the narrative that gets told about like sort of filter bubbles and echo chambers, which the empirical evidence behind echo chambers and filter bubbles has always been spotty, to say the least. It's generally been.
Well, can you specify that at all?
Sure. Sorry. So echo chambers and filter bubbles refers to this idea that people will self-select into news media diets that align with their political preferences. And
that totally ignores the phenomenon of hate reading and hate watching.
Right? It ignores all that, which is, something that should not be overlooked. It's an important part for a lot of people's news media diet, especially news junkies.
Yeah.
But I think what it also does, well, first I should just say that it's been a very enduring story that gets told about people's news media consumption, despite the fact that the empirical evidence surrounding it is all but non-existent. For the most part, studies into echo chambers and filter bubbles find that people generally concentrate on a small number of very large, big name brands in news media, rather than spend a lot of time trying to find their sort of like ideological echo chamber. Which, getting back to sort of how people find themselves to news sites and news stations, makes a lot of sense because most people don't spend a lot of time with news. And so they're not going to go trying to sort of curate the perfect news media diet for themselves. They're just going to go to whatever is right there at the top of their Google search or something like that. But the other aspect of this that I've always found troublesome is that it's not very kind to people. It suggests that people don't want to be pushed at all, that they just want to be appeased, basically. They just want stuff that will make them feel good for the beliefs that they have, which might be true, but it's not how people want to see themselves. And I think that's the important thing here.
Mhm.
And that's what I sort of learned from doing these interviews, was that even if these people that I was interviewing were getting news from outlets that were attempting to give them exactly what they wanted from an ideological perspective, the people that I interviewed weren't reacting to that by thinking, this is great because now I don't have to think at all and I really like to not think. They were saying, I'm a critical thinker, and so I'm getting exactly what I want from this outlet, but I know
Mm.
that that's what they're doing.
Mhm.
And so that's why I have to also look elsewhere to make sure that I'm getting critically engaged in a way by the opposition.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, is this people perceiving, okay, there's this media outlet, it's sort of pandering to me or it's giving me what they think I want. Is that, you're saying that's not new, or is there signs of that changing in any way? Or was the time of this interview just an especially fraught moment for that kind of
Yeah.
questioning?
It's hard to say if it's new or not new. I mean, my guess would be that people have never wanted to think of themselves as being given news that will encourage them to be uncritical.
But it's also a response in a way that some news outlets brand themselves, the resistance on MSNBC, right? And Fox News, that is, they're responding to a product that labels them in a way that feels recent to me, in
Yeah.
a way. I think it's sort of like, golden age of, post-war American network news didn't label itself as we're the news program for these kind of people.
Yes.
Whereas that is entirely baked into a lot of the way that news is marketed now.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that you're right. And I guess my response is that I don't necessarily think that people thinking of themselves as critical thinkers, as critical news consumers, I don't think that that is new. But I do think that their perception of how news outlets are presenting themselves has changed in that way. Because we've talked to young people who would say this, and a lot of the people that we interviewed were wishing, they were pining for Walter Cronkite.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted this performed neutrality, just the facts.
Mm-hmm.
Here's today's news. I don't have a dog in this fight
Mm-hmm.
approach to news consumption, to news production. And we even heard this from people who there's no way they were alive when Walter Cronkite was on the air, and there's like, I just missed the era of Walter Cronkite. He's like, what are you talking about?
That's fascinating. Right.
But
Yeah.
it's exactly what you're saying, which is their perception of the news as being oppositional toward one another. Like MSNBC is pitting itself as the opponent to Fox, and Fox is pitting itself as the opponent to sort of like the rest of the news media, essentially, the liberal media. And this actually gets to something that is a hunch that was always sort of like implicit in these interviews. This idea that cable news is, when people talk about journalism, what they're really talking about is cable news. They're not talking about newspapers. They're not talking about news websites. They're not talking about news radio. They're talking about CNN. They're talking about Fox. They're talking about MSNBC. And those brands are so omnipresent. They take up so much space in their minds. The things that they are faulting those channels for is a stand-in for how they feel about journalism writ large.
Are you approaching this mistrust as a problem to be solved, or just as a phenomenon that has occurred for a variety of reasons? And I guess the first thing I want to ask is, were you doing these interviews before or after people stopped washing their groceries in the early days of COVID, right? That is to say, so is a certain amount of mistrust sort of organically necessary and appropriate and, I hesitate to say, but I'll just say natural, given a particular set of events and developments.
Yeah. I think that how much should people distrust institutions have weighed very heavily on Seth and me as we've been doing this research. Well, the first question, should people distrust, I think is a pretty easy question to answer. And that is, yeah, like I think that we would never try to argue that people should approach institutions with complete confidence at any given moment, because no institution is perfect. All these institutions are fallible. They've all made mistakes. They've all done things that are wrong. And that's why people should be a little skeptical, I guess, when it comes to them. I think that where we get hung up on this is, what is the right formula? Because it's a question of degree, basically. And really what I think we've been sort of trying to come to some argument around, and we're still sort of hashing it out, is there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, it seems like people feel deeply cynical toward these institutions. And as a result, they are not giving these institutions really any credibility. When you embrace cynicism, you sort of shut down any opportunity for those institutions to win you back, to win you over. Because anything that those institutions attempt to present to you as a counterargument, you've already dismissed out of hand as being manipulative. If you're coming at these things from a place of skepticism, then you're open to either being proven wrong or having these institutions demonstrate to you that they are indeed trustworthy.
Did that distinction come out in the interviews where people were professing skepticism and then some probing and it reveals itself as cynicism, or there's a kind of affective or emotional or kind of personal sense of personal betrayal almost under this?
We kept calling it skepticism. We did these interviews in 2020. And for the last 4 years, we've been referring to these people that we've interviewed as being deeply skeptical towards these institutions. But what we're realizing now is that cynicism actually is a more accurate descriptor because of how much more of a dead end cynicism is. I was reading an interview with the author Marilyn Robinson, and she actually is the one who made this distinction between skepticism and cynicism. And I think that she's actually the one who said that cynicism is a dead end. And she said skepticism is I forget her exact words, but she was advocating for skepticism, but referred to cynicism as a dead end. And when I saw that, I thought that is sort of what we need as sort of our anchor. When I say our, I mean Seth and me, as we think about what our answer is to the question of should people trust these institutions, and if so, how much? And to give you an example of sort of what I mean by this is. So we did these interviews in 2020. We did another batch of interviews 2 years later about people's trust in news as it relates to their understanding of how journalists make money. What we found was that people had this idea of news organizations as being completely profit-driven at the expense of any other goals that they may have. As a result, any news that they generate, that they produce, is always going to be inaccurate because the primary goal is to get a huge audience, is to manipulate in hopes that it will somehow lead to more corporate sponsorships, to
Scaling a paywall, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's all with the bottom line in mind. And from my perspective and from Seth's perspective, it's not like we think that the news media is completely pure when it comes to the economics of journalism. We both worked in journalism. We know that it is an incredibly fraught profession precisely because of market considerations. However, we also know that most of the people that we've met, that we worked with, that work in journalism are not doing it because they're trying to manipulate the public. They're not doing it because they want to strike it rich, mislead you,
Right.
And that, I think, is a really important distinction, so even if we are consuming news, Seth and I, and we're thinking like, oh, this outlet is like we're aware of the shortcomings of an outlet based on its economic model, or before you started talking about Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, like I have my misgivings about how Jeff Bezos is running the Washington Post, and I may have my ideological argument with that organization. However, if you put a Washington Post story in front of me right now, I would still assume that it was accurate, because I would assume that it was well vetted by journalists and editors who took a good faith effort to do their jobs with integrity.
Sure. And who would suffer severe professional consequences if they
Exactly.
did something blatantly false. That distinction between what journalists do and the way that the thing that they do is received is sort of mediated by this, media organization, right? And so I wonder if you could talk about that in the context of the other two big institutions you talk about, or two big industries, medicine and higher ed. There could seem to be kind of a structural relationship here where there are professionals in these industries who have one set of values, and people regard them individually in a certain way, but then regard kind of the larger industry they're working in a different way.
So I think that what you just said is true. And I think that it's another similarity that we found between these institutions. And I'm going to leave higher education out just because we're actually about to embark on the interviews about higher education. So I don't want to speak for that as yet because I don't know for sure what people will weigh in on that. But when it comes to journalism and healthcare, what we found as an interesting overlap between the two is that people trust the individual. They trust their primary care provider more than they trust the institution. So people have serious critiques of healthcare. They have serious critiques of the news media, but they trust the person that they deal with. So if you have a doctor, you trust that person. And what's interesting is that there's not really an analog for that in journalism because people don't have like their own local journalists that they deal with. And that is more a result of like the fractured news media environment and the collapsing of the economic model.
But the longing for a figure like Walter Cronkite seems like precisely the desire for that kind of figure.
Exactly. A connection that you feel with a person that you think is doing this job with integrity.
Yeah.
And it's not quite there anymore in journalism the way that it once was. And it's weird to think that it was that way with Walter Cronkite because, I think that the reason why it works in medicine is because you have your doctor that you actually see. It's almost like, and to me, it seems like the analog to that, if there were to be one, would be you have a local journalist, someone that you would run into at like events or city council meetings or whatever. But I think you're right. I actually think that the news anchor fills that gap as well. But for some reason, I don't know. I think that people don't feel like an affinity with news anchors. I think it gets back to Walter Cronkite's approach of sort of being just the facts and people feeling like there's no news anchors that do that anymore. I do think that like Lester Holt, I know he's about to retire, but he's trying to do that. To me, people's reaction to someone like Lester Holt and seeing him approach it as though he's Walter Cronkite, but not be interpreted as though he's Walter Cronkite, be received instead as though he's just another biased news anchor.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that says more about the moment than it does about the delivery. I don't think that there's anything Lester Holt is doing that makes his approach significantly different from what Walter Cronkite was doing. But we all are existing in this current moment where there's so much opposition, like whatever station he's on, someone at another station is saying you can't trust him, that people feel like, well, all right, I can't trust any of it, so I'm gonna just assume it's all compromise. I think if Walter Cronkite was on TV right now, people would say, well, he's just another hack. I'm serious.
I think that's right. I think that, yeah. So we're talking on February 27th. Within the past few days, Jeff Bezos, owner of the Washington Post, announced a major shift in the editorial policy of the newspaper that he owns. He posted on X, "I am of America and for America and proud to be so. Our country did not get here by being typical, and a big part of America's success has been freedom in the economic realm and everywhere else. Freedom is ethical, it minimizes coercion, and practical. It drives creativity, invention, and prosperity." And then he says, to that end, the Washington Post will be advocating for personal liberties and free markets. Right? The New York Times is reporting this gleefully, we might add. Thoughts about that kind of turn? Is that an exception? Is that just an acceleration of trends that have already been happening? How much stock should people put in that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to speak to this as a journalism studies scholar first and foremost. So the thing that is most interesting to me about this development is how quickly the industry is beginning to sour on the idea of a billionaire buying a news organization. Just talking about the economics of journalism right now and of running a news organization, it just feels like there are no good options, basically. The advent of the internet killed the ad section of your daily newspaper, which really crippled the economic model of most news organizations. And a lot of news organizations quickly started putting their content online for free, thinking that they would be able to either get digital advertising dollars to make up the difference or eventually turn those people into paid subscribers, neither of which panned out. As a result, for decades, news organizations have been trying to figure out how can we get a handle on the situation and make news sustainably. And each time there's been excitement about a specific intervention or idea, or in the case of Jeff Bezos, a person, it's been a disappointment. And when Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post, I forgot what year it was, there was suspicion, but then he invested a ton of money into that organization and hired Marty Baron to be the editor-in-chief. And it really seemed like there was this commitment to making it just a really high quality news outlet. And on the one hand, it probably will continue to be a really high quality news outlet, just the same way that I think the Wall Street Journal is a very high quality news outlet. And I don't read their editorials either. So,
Well, let me ask you, is what Bezos doing an extension of or actually meaningfully different from Rupert Murdoch? That is to say, in a figure like Bezos, you have, and in fact, a lot of what's going on now, you have these already consolidated media empires, and then Silicon Valley, big business generally, and government, right? And that this has been made, this was certainly made visually explicit at the inauguration. Is that accurate, or
I mean, I think that at least in the case of what Bezos is doing, it is nakedly transparent. I don't know if that means that like Rupert Murdoch is emailing the editorial writers of the Wall Street Journal and saying like, "What's on the docket today? Can we make sure that it's something that will make me happy?" You know, like I don't think he cares. You know, and I think that we've been talking sort of about like the professional culture, the professional norms, of these organizations. If you are working for the Wall Street Journal's editorial section, you don't need to be told by Rupert Murdoch what kind of editorials to write. You believe that already. That's why you're there. You self-selected for that job because you share those values. Like, you're not acting disingenuously. You're not writing things that you disagree with. You're doing exactly what you want to be doing in the venue that is most excited to have you sharing that perspective. And getting back to sort of like the excitement that greeted Bezos, the very cautious excitement that greeted Bezos when he first took over the post, I believe he put out a number of statements and gave a number of interviews that suggested that he didn't really care if it made money or not. He was invested in it because he was invested in like quality journalism.
almost approaching funding or sponsoring journalism as a kind of quasi philanthropy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that would be in sharp distinction to a news outlet that actually relies on customers paying for what it gives, right? And you would think, well, okay, a kind of philanthropic model would allow more leeway, experimentation, freedom, and so on, right? But it's also can be far more contingent,
Yeah.
subject to more manipulation. Are there any outlets that are really funded by subscribers?
Yeah, and the New York Times is increasingly funded by subscribers.
Okay.
Like each year, a larger portion of their revenue comes from subscriptions than the year before. It's not easy. And the problem that we're seeing right now with the New York Times' success is that the New York Times is so singular.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask.
It's sort of like sucking all the air out of the room for other outlets. But it is possible. The problem is that you kind of need money to make money in this world. The New York Times has so much capital behind it. A great deal of their success, it seems to me at least, stems from the fact that the New York Times made the very smart decision to bundle its news offerings with non-news offerings like Wordle and the cooking app and Wirecutter. And they bought The Athletic. None of these things are hard news. But when you have these incredibly addictive games that people love to play, and you have a cooking app that people love to use for recipes, and you have a review company or review leg of your operation that's reviewing absolutely every consumer good out there, people will buy your news if it comes with all of that. But also, they have the money to invest in the user experience of their offerings. Their app is seamless. Everything loads so quickly. There have been studies that show that if people attempt to look at a news story and it takes even like a fraction of a second longer to load, they're going to close it.
Right.
They'll just move on. That is how quickly these decisions are getting made about people's news consumption. And the New York Times knows that. And so you need that money to get that subscription base. Most news organizations don't have that money to begin with.
So we have something like the New York Times, which is sort of singular or sort of very hard to reproduce elsewhere. We have dependence on advertising and sort of ownership by larger unrelated industries. And then there's the figure of the kind of, journalists moving to Substack in different ways, a kind of sort of entrepreneurial journalism, journalists who leave a news organization and then cultivate a kind of relationship with their followers, try to get subscriptions out of that. I'm thinking of Glenn Greenwald, Barry Weiss, Ken Klippenstein, actually a couple people from The Intercept, I feel like have gone that route. Thoughts about that model, of that kind of sort of singular journalist who cultivates their own following? What are the strengths and weaknesses of that? What's the future of that?
So I think that the big weakness of that is you need to have that following before you go. You need to have essentially worked at a legacy news organization, or you need to work at an organization with enough of a public presence to garner enough people that they will follow you. And if you don't have that, then you will not make it, because it is very hard to build that following from the very small platform of Substack,
Mm-hmm.
rather than build that following at a bigger platform and then taking that elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a huge burden if you don't already have it. Assuming that you do have it and you take it with you, it's all on you. It's all on you. You're doing this all yourself. I guess if you make it work, Barry Weiss is I think running the Free Press, or so she, has this operation that she's in charge of. But I don't think that the money that she's making isn't coming entirely from like public donations via Substack. Like, I think that she at this point has a number of like very wealthy donors that are making what she's doing sustainable. And that brings me to another part of this, which is I think that not all, but a not coincidentally large number of the people who have left legacy news organizations, started a Substack, and found success have done so by embracing this narrative of I was censored in my legacy, quote unquote, corporate media job. But now that I'm untethered from these sinister forces, I can tell you how it really is. So support me, and I can finally speak to you honestly.
I hear an edge of cynicism in your account of that.
I find it truly repellent. I really do.
Say why?
The most succinct way I can put it is that these people that are taking this approach are using the public cynicism toward the news media as a way to make money. They are profiting from public cynicism toward the very institution that they came from. And I find it very frustrating because they're kind of stabbing their former colleagues in the back, basically. They're telling the public, like, I worked with these people. You can't trust them. Trust me. Don't trust those people. I had to leave those people because I couldn't trust them anymore. Like, the most recent example of this is Taylor Lorenz, who, in her way of presenting herself now, argues that she was never sort of a quote-unquote good fit with legacy media, which is true. She always sort of was like towing this line between like aspiring influencer, content creator, but also like tech journalist. And I think that combination made her a very appealing hire from the perspective of these legacy brands that hired her, but also created tension at these organizations as well. I think that the work that she's doing now that she's struck out on her own is valuable. I wish that she didn't feel compelled to say that the reason why her work is more valuable now is because she's untethered from corporate media. I wish that she could do her job now without suggesting to her followers or supporters or whatever that corporate media, as she refers to it, is inherently untrustworthy.
And so in a way, it's sort of a kind of fractal replication of the way that, say, like the big three cable news channels define themselves in opposition to each other, right? That same kind of mutually excluding or mutually defining relationship breaks down between media outlets and then even down to individual journalists themselves. Right? The same kind of competitive logic. Is there any way out of that?
Something that I have argued, as you know, is that the institutions that are under this attack and the organizations that are facing the consequences of these attacks need to be more transparent about the role that money does play in how they make their decisions, so that they can actually demonstrate to the public that the skepticism is warranted, but the cynicism is not. Because right now, the attacks are explicit, the defenses are implicit.
For listeners, 3 news outlets, relatively unknown, that you would recommend to curious, thoughtful readers that are not household names.
Let's see. Well, the first one will be a local one, and it's a podcast called CityCast Salt Lake. They've got a daily podcast about stuff that's happening in our backyard in Salt Lake City. And the podcast itself is great, and they have a newsletter that goes out every day that I really like. I am increasingly a big fan of Axios, both at the local level and the national level. For those of you listening that don't know, Axios is very bite-sized news, basically. It's like a newsletter that comes every day that I get for Salt Lake City, but it is available for national also. And it's just sort of like, here's what's happening, here's why it matters, here's what's next, that kind of thing. And I like it because I feel like the news can feel so depressing that I don't want to look at it. But if I can like go through a newsletter, feel pretty informed pretty quickly and go about the rest of my day. I'm trying to think of a third one that is sort of off the beaten path, but instead I'm just going to give one that is not at all off the beaten path, but says a lot more about where my mind is right now than it is anywhere else. And it's The Hollywood Reporter. Because I honestly, I spend a lot of my time reading news about movies. And I think that this is important to include anyway, because I feel like oftentimes when we think about news consumption, we think that it has to be hard news. And I think, in my opinion, and I tell this to my students all the time, anytime that you spend on your device that's not on social media, that is instead consuming content from a reputable brand that makes content, even if it's like soft news, like The Hollywood Reporter or, any of the other places I get movie news from, like Variety or Deadline or whatever. I think that leaves you so much better off than it would if you're just endlessly scrolling. That is really, I would say that my news media diet right now is basically exactly what I just said. It's these newsletters in the morning, it's the New York Times throughout the day, but also it's primarily movie news as escapism for me. I deleted my social media 2 years ago now, maybe around then. And I'm still spending plenty of time on my phone, but it's more with this kind of content than it is with anything else.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being on the show, and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.
This has been a conversation with Jake Nelson, Professor of Communication at the University of Utah. I'm Robert Carson, Associate Director of the Tanner Humanities Center here at the U, and thank you for listening to the Virtual Jewel Box, our podcast. Views expressed on the Virtual Jewel Box do not represent the official views of the University of Utah, and however much you might mistrust the media, you can always trust our theme song, Jelly Roll Morton's Perfect Rag.